Okay, let's try this again. Welcome to Forking Off, the podcast for people who said no to just following orders, where we explore the very personal decisions behind leaving federal service, whether by choice or by force. Every departure has a story, and we're here to share them.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of Forking Off. I'm Jill Fields.
And I'm Philip Fields.
And today we have with us Andrew Kreider. Hi, Andrew.
Hey, Jill. Hey, Philip. I appreciate being here.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're so
Yeah.
excited to have you. So why don't we go ahead and get started with your bluff, your bottom line up front.
Yeah, right on. So I'm Andrew Kreider. I recently left the Environmental Protection Agency Region 3 office in Philadelphia, where I had been for 29 years. I served a number of roles at EPA, and I left through EPA's DRP, or Deferred Resignation Program 2.0, in June.
That's a long time with EPA.
Indeed. It is actually, I said to somebody the other day, I had a longer relationship with EPA than I have with most people in my life, including my 20-year-old daughter. So yeah, it was quite a bit of time.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you ended up in public service?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a native of Pennsylvania. I'm a 10th generation Pennsylvanian, and I'm actually the first of all of those generations to obtain a college degree. I went to school to study political science. I loved learning about the government. I would nerd out on things like the Constitution and separation of powers and all of that. From very early days, I had this strong environmental ethic. You know, my parents at one point had started an addition to our childhood home, and they created this room off of the kitchen that was supposed to be like the entryway where you came in and shed all of your clothes and all of your muddy stuff. And in high school, I completely co-opted that and made it into like an in-home recycling center. So instead of like coats and boots, it was filled with cardboard boxes that were separated by number if they were plastics or, glass. And then about once a month, I would sort of compel my mom to drive us to this recycling center where they took in all of the recyclables that like local collection wouldn't accept. So I always had a very strong environmental ethic. And I mean, I considered myself lucky as a first generation college graduate to have been given that opportunity, and I wanted to give back. And so a few months after graduating from Penn State, I found a job at the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C., worked there for about 5 years, and then moved back to our Region 3 office in Philadelphia. A lot of people don't know, but most federal employees don't work in Washington, D.C.
I know, right?
Yeah, so we think about DC as the sort of place where all the feds work. That's really not the case. There are offices and laboratories and installations all over the country. So I spent the majority of my career in EPA's Region 3 office in Philadelphia.
That is something really important to say, because I know out here in LA, people would ask, oh, what do you do? And, oh, I work for the federal government. I work for the FBI. And they'd be like, we have that here?
Right.
And you're like, yeah, I promise. Like, there are people everywhere who are federal employees.
I'm not going to lie, when I started at the FBI, it was surprising to me how many places they had offices. I had been to the federal building in Los Angeles before for VA appointments and didn't know the FBI was in the same building.
Yeah, it's, I live in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and throughout that entire career, people would say to me, so do you commute to Washington? Like, did you do that every day? Like, no, we have an office with like 800 people right here in Philadelphia, and we manage the entire Mid-Atlantic region from that office.
Yeah, it's wild. My dad was a federal employee with Army Corps of Engineers, and that was in Vicksburg, Mississippi, little town. Most of the people living in Vicksburg were there because of the Corps.
Right.
So it was federal employees. You're everywhere.
That's right.
That is really cool. Growing up with the Save the Earth and Save the Planet and Captain Planet and
Fern Gully.
Right. It's excellent.
Yeah, we were like, this is really great. But 29 years doing work with the EPA, what happened?
It is a long time, and I worked in a number of roles. EPA has so many programs. I'll touch on just one or two quickly. Have either of you ever heard of the term brownfields?
No.
Okay, so a brownfield is a property that has already been developed in some sense. And people are really concerned about what might have happened there. Maybe you had like a gas station there over the course of history, or you had a small business or a little manufacturing facility, and now it's boarded up and abandoned. And so what happens is developers don't want to use that property because they're concerned about contamination and liability. Well, EPA about 20 years ago launched a program called the Brownfields Economic Redevelopment Initiative, and it was eventually passed into law and solidified as a true program. But the way this program works is EPA receives money and passes that money through to state or local governments for the purpose of going out and environmentally assessing these brownfields and helping them move toward redevelopment and become, job creating locations. There's so many good things that come from that, right? So you're not developing on a green field, which is, an open space or a parkland or a woodlot or something. Instead, you're enabling developers to reuse property that has already been in development because you're getting rid of the environmental concerns. So I worked in that program for 8 or 10 years, and it was so gratifying. So one story in particular that will always stick with me comes out of Lancaster City, Pennsylvania. I managed a grant to the Lancaster County Planning Commission, and they had come to EPA and they had said, look, right in the middle of town, we have this sort of park. It's the place where, youth groups and sports leagues go and they plan their pickup baseball or softball games. But the property has a little bit of a checkered history. We just want to learn more about what's going on and make sure that it's safe for everybody. And then we want to do something meaningful with it. And so we awarded a grant to the Lancaster County Planning Commission in Pennsylvania. They went out, they did this assessment, and they found out, well, yeah, there were some things that happened here. Using our money, the county was able to take care of the environmental concerns and then create a true active recreation space with this beautiful baseball diamond and rehabilitate that park into like a community treasure. And I was there at the beginning, walking the property with the county as they explained what they wanted to do. And I was there at the end when they cut the ribbon on this park and invited the kids of Lancaster to come in and play in a safe, well taken care of environment. For me, that was just so gratifying, right? And all I did really was manage the EPA side of that grant, meet with these folks regularly, review their progress reports, answer their questions, provide the technical guidance. And in the end, here's a park in a city in Pennsylvania. So that was awesome.
That's cool. That town now has this great park. I love it.
Yeah, I don't know that people realize, but a large part of EPA's budget actually comes into EPA and then goes right back out the door through grant programs. There are state environmental and public health agencies in every state in the US, and they all receive funding from EPA to support their core work. So if you see, your state Department of Environmental Protection out there doing something and permitting facilities or doing public education or cleaning up waterways, in all likelihood, some of the funding they're using came from the Environmental Protection Agency. So a lot of my career was working in these grant programs and helping states and local governments and nonprofit organizations do important work using the money that is given to EPA.
That program sounds really interesting. I would think after something like COVID, where a lot of businesses have been shuttered for an extended period of time, programs like that might be really useful in helping get the economy back to where it was before that time frame.
No, that's absolutely right. And the impact is, I would say, most often felt in communities that have not necessarily a truly urban core, but have like a downtown area where historically businesses existed and now they've left or fallen into disrepair. So I'll talk about my hometown of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. That's a town that grew up around the steel industry. And then when the American steel industry suffered a bunch of losses back in the 70s, early 80s, Phoenixville's entire income base, it was just gone. All of those facilities were left empty. So the promise of brownfields redevelopment is that you bring economic restoration to communities like Phoenixville who have the space and they have the residents there who want to do the work. You just need the income generating, job creating businesses. over the course of my career, people would try to draw this false dichotomy between the environment and the economy. But in fact, all along, EPA, while committed to our mission of protecting public health and the environment, has been creating opportunities for economic growth, whether that's cleaning up contaminated land or, taking pollution out of rivers that flow through communities. All of the work we do has economic benefits.
Absolutely. So before you left EPA, you were doing more public affairs, communications type work?
Yeah. So the last 2.5 or 3 years of my career, I moved into the work that was almost directly aligned with my degree from Penn State. So there is a little bit of that, like full closure, like appropriate closure of my career. And my day-to-day job was working directly with congressional offices, the offices of state elected officials, local government leaders, serving as a liaison between those offices and EPA. An example of my job, there could be a congressperson in Virginia who has a constituent. That person is struggling with some sort of issue on their property, or flooding from a local river, or they've got radon intrusion in their home, and they just have questions about how can EPA help, or what has EPA done in this situation. And so they reach out to their congressperson, and the congressperson comes to EPA and says, my constituent needs help with this. Can you help them? And then it was my job to make sure that I found the right people at EPA and could link them up with that constituent and get those questions resolved. So there was a lot more that goes into it, but that, I think, was the most common part of my job, was really just deciphering EPA for this congressperson's office so that they could better help their constituents. The neat thing was, it was completely nonpartisan, right? It never mattered to me or to any of us what party this congressperson or elected official belonged to. We were there to help people. Those members of Congress were serving their constituents, and we were part of providing that service. Yeah. So also full circle, it goes back to like the drive that brought me to government in the first place, which is to give back and to use what I've learned to help other people who haven't had the same opportunities.
I love that. Helping people in a different way than you were for most of your career. So you said earlier you took the second deferred resignation. You saw the first one and said no.
Yeah, I said more than no, but we can leave it at no for the purposes of this. I don't have a military background, but I have always been very respectful of the chain of command. I don't want to spend much time on that first fork, but I will just say, receiving an email from a sketchy email address that purports to be from the Office of Personnel Management, offering me something that sounds also sketchy, potentially not allowable, there was nothing appealing to me there. So we all received that email, right? I think it went to almost everybody in the federal government. And naturally, we had questions. And so we went to our management at EPA and said, can you explain to us more about this? And our management said, we know as much as you do, which means we don't know anything. We got the same email. Nobody communicated any details of this program to us. And for me, that felt a lot like somebody going around my chain of command and asking me to do something that perhaps wasn't legitimate and didn't follow the process. And I say all of that not to take away from anybody who accepted that fork. It just didn't sit right with me.
I accepted it, and it didn't sit right with me either. But at that time, I was leaving no matter what. So totally understand.
We were taking a chance.
Right. And there were people. I mean, there's a very close colleague of mine who, she and I went back and forth about that. And she asked me, what are you going to do? And I explained to her everything I've just shared here and said, I'm not doing anything with this. I'm not touching it. And she opted to. And yeah, we had several people from our office who left in the first fork. I waited for the second. So what I said was, if a similar offer comes down through the appropriate channels, then I would consider it. But the first couple months, well, let me just step back and say, so I've worked for 6 different presidential administrations, 5 different presidents. They've been Republican and Democrat, and I've served them all the same. You stick to the mission, and you're here, you're working for the people, and it doesn't matter who's in charge. You follow directions and you carry on. It became very clear in the first couple of months of this administration that we were dealing with something, I'm going to use the overused word of unprecedented, but let me just paint a picture of what January and February looked like at EPA. So EPA management, right out of the gates, violated a signed contract with our labor union, eliminating rights that had been afforded to EPA employees through this contract. They immediately sent home a number of my colleagues who worked on community engagement or environmental justice issues. And then they realized, wait, we sent too many of them home. So they brought some of them back. And then they fired some of them and then realized that they messed up when they fired them. So they rehired them, but made them stay at home and wouldn't let them work. And they did all of this without any sort of proper consideration for the impacts on these people, or without really following normal HR protocols. So it was a mess. Agency leadership began sending out these weekly messages to all staff that were incredibly political in nature, unlike anything I'd ever seen. They began terminating grants similar to the ones we talked about already. So what would happen is a recipient of an EPA grant would log into the portal from which they can get reimbursement for the work they've done, and their funds were frozen. So they did not have access to their funds. The agency instructed the EPA staff who worked with those grantees not to talk to them. So you had, within a couple of months, literally hundreds of organizations around the country who were relying on funding from EPA to do their jobs and to pay their people and to help their communities, who no longer had access to their money and whose calls to EPA were not being answered. And that's because EPA directed staff not to talk to their grantees. So just a terrible situation. So I was in the public affairs office. And so what naturally happens, if you are a grantee and you call your EPA contact and they'd never call you back, you start to panic. And so you call your congressperson. And what does your congressperson do when they hear from a constituent whose EPA money has been frozen? They call EPA. And the person they called at EPA was me. So I would get these calls and these emails saying, Andrew, can you please explain to me why EPA has frozen the money that was legally allocated to this organization? I was told to wait and hear what our office in DC would give to me in terms of what I was allowed to tell to the member of Congress or the media, because we had media calling us as well. And what I was told to convey to these organizations was that everything EPA was doing was normal, that this is a normal part of the process when we change presidential administrations. And that was not true. And I know that because I've been at EPA for almost 29 years, and I'd managed grants for as long as I'd been there, and nothing like this had happened before. So I was being told to essentially stonewall and lie to members of Congress and the media. And that wasn't cool with me. Like, that's not my MO.
No.
You're right. So that is the situation in which I agreed to participate in a solidarity walk. And this was a nationally coordinated effort across almost all of EPA's regional offices, where employees and alumni and supporters essentially took to the street over our lunch break to draw attention to what was happening, to all of this that I've described. And during the course of that walk, I was photographed by members of the press and I was interviewed, and I spoke freely about what was happening because I was on annual leave. And those of you who are not feds may not understand what annual leave is, but it's essentially PTO. I was on my time, not the government's, in my own capacity. So yeah, I was very vocal. I mean, I was incredibly concerned. I've always been, as I said, I respect the chain of command. I am driven by my integrity, and a lot of what was happening violated, both of those in a number of different ways. Well, I participated in this walk, and the administrator himself, I have been told, saw a picture of me in the Philadelphia Inquirer and said to an audience of senior officials at EPA, although he did not name me, he called me out by photo, by position, and by regional office, and said that I was an example of the kind of employee who, and I'm going to use air quotes, makes his job more difficult. So I heard this from a colleague of mine in Washington, and my immediate response was, good, because my job's been really difficult since you came on board. And so if your job is now difficult, excellent. So 10 days later, I was removed from my job in the Office of Public Affairs, and I was placed into a different program. Although that action was not a disciplinary action, and I retained my pay and my grade, I was no longer able to interface with the public or serve the members of Congress with whom I had been working. And this is a long story, but I'm about to sum it up. So what that told me was I no longer worked in a place where First Amendment rights would be afforded to me. And so if I was not able in my personal capacity and while not in work status to speak freely, this was most likely not the place where I wanted to work anymore. And so it became a choice between, do I keep my job or do I keep my voice? And I chose to keep my voice. And so when that deferred resignation program was announced in late April, early May, I took it and I left EPA in June.
Wow. It's sad. And I'm sorry. I'm glad you made his job difficult because seriously,
so am I.
I mean, he was making your job impossible and making other people's jobs impossible and making it impossible for American communities to be able to be economically viable.
Absolutely. And, to walk down the hallway when I was still at EPA and see all of these folks who just wanted to help the communities struggle with the fact that they weren't allowed to even speak to them. I mean, what is that? Well, I'm going to say to a person, if you were drawn to public service, you're drawn there because you're focused on service. So when you tell a federal employee who's focused on public service that they are no longer allowed to serve, that's huge, right? There's a lot of cognitive dissonance. You show up for work, but you're not allowed to do the job that you feel passionate about. So yeah, very, very stressful internally. Yeah, we had a lot of people who struggled with that. Obviously, a number of people have left EPA and other agencies too. You're both familiar with this. And we were in a position where EPA was no longer meeting the mission.
Wow. That's scary. It's the ripple effect of everything. We've seen that with so many different organizations, like the ripple effects of one thing happens, or they stop the flow of information, or they stop the flow of money, or they just stop a program. And that has resounding impact across the country.
Yeah. And it's, EPA is just one agency. They're the employees of EPA and the communities, whom we fund. But then there are a whole host of federal contractors, right, who support the mission, who have been impacted by these changes. So yeah, the consequences are far-reaching for sure. And we talked about, at the beginning of our conversation, how widespread these federal agencies are. And so, these impacts are hitting communities, from coast to coast.
And with EPA in particular, we've talked with a few people now where there's been this theme of sort of an undoing of progress. EPA, in the grand scheme of things, isn't an extremely old organization. I think it was around like 1970 or so.
1970.
I spent some time on this stuff in school. They made us read like Silent Spring and
yeah, good.
But yeah, like where we came from initially, right, with the water quality and the air quality to now, like being able to restore sites like this, like going forward, I can only hope that those types of things are rebuilt. But another theme we've seen is like a lot of people are saying it's going to take a generation to recover from that. This is in a time where, we're projecting forecasts about how much time we have to really make meaningful environmental impact. A generation seems like a long time when we've got 2030 and 2050 timelines to get our stuff together.
It's true. Yeah, I mean, especially when you talk about, climate change, both mitigating climate change, reducing our contribution to it, but then also building up our resiliency to the extreme weather impacts, temperature increases and variations that are associated with that. Yeah, this isn't really the time to step back. It's the time to double down. And unfortunately, that is not what we're doing.
Yeah, especially when we're trying to motivate and inspire countries that don't have the resources that we do to make changes like this. What kind of example are we setting for the world?
Yeah, that, and to take it a step further, there's setting the example, but there's also, are we going to lead or are we going to fall behind? And we have been talking for years about, it's so interesting because I've done some climate change education, and when I began that work 15 years ago, you'd hear objections from people that would say the United States should not be doing as much good environmental work unless China is doing an equal amount of environmental work. Well, we're now at the point where China is surpassing the United States in terms of investments in renewable and clean energy. The boat is leaving and we're missing it. And we're missing it because we're not doubling down and that's going to have repercussions too for at least a generation, if not more.
Yeah, 100%. I wrote a paper on this in school. And to me, it was wild that we talk about the need for energy independence and clean energy and everything. And there's this burgeoning economy around it. And right now, yeah, China is leaning full force into it, and it's going well for them. We've got the foundations there, but the sort of investment from government that went into things like becoming the global leader for the internet and big tech and everything else, defense investments, like that's everything that we need to win this same race. And like the benefit to the American economy, especially if we like start building these things at home. We've talked about all of these sites in the US that we could responsibly develop for the resources that we need to win those fights. Like we just don't seem to have it in us to do it now. Yeah, it's disappointing to me because I thought we were on the right track and I thought that things were going to go well.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help, as you mentioned, the type of investment we need to think about what's going on in the media now with we're building a new ballroom on the White House, and we're talking about building an arch for the country's 250th birthday. And those are measured in the millions, and what we need is investment in the billions. But still, that's how we're going to spend money. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, but I mean, I worked in an R&D shop at one point in my career, and millions of dollars for R&D goes a long ways. Like when you're working on those small projects on something that the government could then turn around and use more broadly, millions of dollars can change the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. But don't worry, we're going to have a very nice ballroom. So, Andrew, I could ask, is there anything that would have changed your decision to leave?
You know, the short answer to that, I actually, no, I won't give you the short answer. I'm just going to say this, like, I did not expect to leave. You know, I was not prepared to end my career at 29 years. Yeah, like I would have stayed. So if the administration had decided to follow the law, okay, that would have been helpful. If they had decided to honor the contracts that they made with their employees, you know, and the communities that they were serving, if they had embodied integrity, you know, comported themselves in the nonpartisan manner that all the rest of the federal employees have over the years, that would have helped. If they had demonstrated a true commitment to the mission, that would have helped. So there are a lot of things, none of which I think are possible with the administration currently. So no, I think given that the first 2 or 3 months looked the way that they did, I don't think anything could have been done to keep me.
Yeah. And that's so sad.
Everybody who chose to leave was in the same boat. There was nothing that was actually going to happen that was going to change our decision.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I have a list of like hypotheticals, but they don't align with the intent of this administration.
Yeah. I'll say, like, for me, looking back, the only thing that would have had to change is everything.
Right. I should have just said that.
I mean, everything would have had to change.
Yeah.
And I mean, I laugh about it, but it's true. You said it earlier, unprecedented. Everything was completely unprecedented. Who would have thought they were going to stop funding the grants that were rightfully given and lawfully given? Who would think that they would do all of the things that have been done? We didn't think that would happen. We thought things would be different, but not so wildly different. Well, Andrew, what have you been up to since you left? What have you been doing?
Yeah, well, in short, like just sort of figuring it out. You know, I told somebody the other day that I don't know that America has experienced a period of time in which the civil service has been under such assault. But at the same time, I don't know that there have ever been as many organizations and people who have beefed up their abilities to support civil servants. The last several months, I've just been diving deep into working with all of these support organizations, trying to make sure that my colleagues still in government and recently departed from government know about all of these great organizations that are out there, you know, that are poised to support them, to either maintain their integrity while they remain employed or to help them pivot and move to their next chapter. So it's been a lot of, meeting people, sharing stories, almost like a national group trauma kind of exercise, trauma therapy exercise. Yeah. And then personally just putting some thought toward how do I continue to give back in the same way that drove me, 29 years ago to join the federal government.
You mentioned like all of the groups that have sprung up. That was something that Philip and I both were like, okay, like people are coming together to help. Like people are finding hope in the midst of complete chaos. There's a whole community. Philip hates that we use the word trauma all the time. He's like, I don't want to give him the word, but Russell said it. That trauma, in quotes, air quotes, trauma has not turned out the way that they expected. I mean, you've got a group of people who want to help people. Well, guess what they're doing? They're helping people and they're helping each other. So it's just made people realize they're resilient and that they can make a difference. And so like these organizations are coming together and doing great things. And thank you for, helping there and finding resources.
Yeah. Looking back, I was at a lot of retirement parties over nearly 3 decades of work at EPA. Every person who retired said that what they would miss most were the people. Like we were all drawn to whatever work we did for the federal government by the mission, to commit and deliver, on behalf of that mission. But by the time we leave, it's the people that we're going to miss the most, right? Even more than the work. And so I think it makes sense that these communities, this community has popped up and all of these organizations are banding together to help support the people. And that is really, as I left EPA, that was sort of my departing words were, remember your oath, honor the mission, take care of each other, and carry on. And that's really what it comes down to. These are challenging times, even if we don't want to use the word traumatic, Philip. But
if that's how people feel, that's how they should describe it.
There's truth there. A lot of people have felt that. But this is the time where you take care of each other. That's how individually we make it through what it is we're going through, and it's how collectively we come out on the other side too.
Absolutely. Well, last question is, would you go back?
I would go back, but obviously not with this administration. And in fact, I would encourage people who have left federal service to not write off federal service, because in 3 years' time, we may very well need to do a lot of rebuilding. The federal government, I think of as like the skeleton upon which the United States of America is built, right? Like we, in more ways than people understand, we hold this country up. There's been a lot of damage done to the federal government and to the people who support this country. And so I think people who have good experience and have that institutional knowledge, we can be very valuable when there's an administration change. If there is a president and a cabinet that come in and want to restore, the federal government to the great and effective government that we had up until a few months ago. So yeah, I would go back and be part of that, but I won't be returning to federal service until leadership demonstrates a respect for law and a commitment to mission and acts daily with integrity.
Yeah. Good answer. I like that. It's still very positive and very hopeful. Maybe things can change.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, hope. Okay, so hope is not a feeling, right? It's a choice, and it is a choice that demands action. And so, like everything that I've done, jumping into this community of supporters, continuing to believe based on what I'm seeing in this community, that innately people are good. There's a lot of damage being done, but I do think we can cut through the noise, and there will come a day where we can kind of step back to the task at hand, right? The tasks that we were committed to previously, and help each other rebuild. So yeah, like I am choosing to be hopeful and believing that the time will come when we can make things right.
Yeah, I think you said it there. Hope requires action, and hope without action is denial. If people want to see that hope come to fruition, they've got to take action. I don't know what that looks like for every person in their own circumstance. Hopefully it's lobbying for change and voting.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing. We have learned so much about what the work that EPA has done. Before we go, is there anything else that you would like to add?
I do want to say I consider both of you to be members of this community of support. And so I want to thank you for sharing our stories and, creating this platform for people to talk about what we've done and why we've left and what we're hopeful for. No, I appreciate you both, and I'm happy to have spent this time with you. Thank you.
Thanks. We feel like this is our one thing we can choose to do is to give a platform and a voice to the people. All right. Well, Andrew, thank you so much today, and thank you for forking off with us.
Anytime.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Forking Off. To our listeners still in government, remember, your integrity is worth more than your TSP. Leaving doesn't mean giving up on public service. It just means finding new ways to serve.
Until next time,
keep your ethics,
keep your dignity,
and we'll keep telling these stories.
If you're a former Fed with a story to tell, or you're wrestling with your own ethical crossroads, reach out to us at info@forkingoff.com.
Today's episode was created, produced, and edited by Jill and Philip Fields. Special thanks to our guest, Andrew Kreider. You can find more information about this episode at forkingoff.com. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, Mastodon, LinkedIn, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Join us Monday, December 8th,
as we talk with former immigration judge Sarah Ellison Hernandez.
When all these changes started happening and I started seeing a little alarm bells, it was kind of like, am I crazy? I took my oath very seriously when I took an oath to defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic, and to follow the rule of law, because there aren't any metaphysical guardrails that are just going to protect America. The guardrails are us. And then we had the Obrego Garcia case, which was pivotal for me. And basically at that moment, what I was seeing personally was an intentional defiance of the law and of court order, kind of saying, what are you going to do about it, court? I mean, the concern is justified. If there's anyone listening out there and you're wondering the same thing, you're not crazy. The concern is justified. I just knew for me, I was not going to wait around until I really got in that position where it was like, are you willing to break the law?